Welcome, citizens of the globe, to the Frontend Heroes podcast, where we discuss all things villainous and heroic about the front end of software development. My name is Evan Payne, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Scott Francis. How are you, Scott?
I'm really good, thanks. Are you?
Yeah, sun is shining. I'm doing really good. Today's episode is sponsored by NetCentric, an award-winning Adobe Global Alliance partner, and both Scott and I work here as senior front-end software engineers, and we're glad, as always, to have their support with this show. Today's topic and the name of the episode is Backend Villains. And, you know, for us, villainous versus heroes, it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek reference. Please don't take offense. In some ways, people think of the backend and front end as two sides of the same coin. But in fact, that might not be a valid metaphor. And to talk more about what I mean, we have two guests with us today. If we could please introduce yourselves one at a time, we have David Pelayo.
Hi, Evan. Thanks for inviting me to this show. As you said, my name is David Pelayo. Been software engineer based and located in Spain since almost 10 years back now. And last years I have been dedicating my time to work as a freelancer and doing some entrepreneurship and running but miserably failing two digital businesses. And now I became part of NetCentric as employee too.
Thanks. And our other guest today is Pabel Sovalevsky.
Hey, hello. Thanks for inviting me. As you said, my name is Pabel Sobolewski. I used to be a full stack developer for quite some time. But last 2 years, I actually narrowed it to just being a front-end developer. So switched front a bit. More of that in details a bit later, I suppose.
Yeah, well, maybe not even later. So where we had the idea for this episode was to, compare the two sides, front end and back end, but also in both of our guests' cases, they've gone one direction or the other. In Pavel's case, he's gone from being a full stack or, focused on the back end and part-time developer to a front end developer. And in David's case, he used to be a front ender and has now grown into more full stack and to the point of being hired as a back end developer. So, yeah, we want to talk around that. But first, I want to pass it over to you, Scott, just to sort of get your impression of the back end. Like, what's stopping you from being a back end developer, or why did you choose front end over back end?
It's an interesting question. And I think one of the things that I've come to realize really as a front ender is that I really enjoy like the back end of front end, if you like. So like some people really buzz off creating amazing things in CSS, and like some of the things that I see out there are really like dazzling, really amazing, and people really enjoy things like focusing on animations and things like that. For me as a front ender, as an engineer, I really think that my strength lies in the JavaScript, and that's really where I actually think that I excel. So in many ways, I also think, well, maybe I should have become a back-end developer. It's not something that I ever really focused on. I mean, my education really was really around front-end technology. I don't really ever think that I dabbled in back-end. Although my first job after university, like the company I was working for was really like not that great, and I ended up writing like some back end, so just PHP, SQL queries, that kind of thing. And I can't say that I didn't enjoy that, but really, like when the time came to focus and zero in on something, it was for me it was front end. But yeah, like I'm always interested to work with the back end guys. Always find it fascinating. So it's something that like in another life I would have been comfortable with, I think.
Interesting. David, what about you? How did you start off in engineering, and what made you choose front end at the time? And well, we can talk more after that.
So I started in the first workplace working as a Java developer for an enterprise solution for IBM in Barcelona. And as the time flew, then I got assigned to a different project in which I had to develop the first front end of a big company. And there I started to realize how cool it was to develop in a way where the outcome was directly visual, right? Because especially when you were showing your results to your partners or even the people you're reporting to, then the effect is quite direct, right? It's easy to understand. And then from that point on, I continued to grow on the front-end path by becoming a more a JavaScript developer. I had to develop a few platforms that which were focused on visualizing kind of big data. So yeah, working with D3.js, SVG technology, years back. And that was like the initial point, right? But then during your career, at least that was the feeling for me, I started to realize that I was lacking some of the insights of the whole of a system itself. And it's not only about APIs or backend development, but it's also most of the times where you're working for big companies, you're losing a lot of the perspective on how the whole solution on the back, what you don't see, how it's built upon, right? And so I was feeling like, well, I know what I do on my stuff on the browser, but I want to know more from that point on. I want to know how everything gets connected, all pieces of the puzzle. And that was where I started.
I find that particularly interesting because that's kind of how I've grown, the opposite direction maybe. So like I started off, barely figuring out how PHP worked within WordPress, and, FTP was just dropping stuff up into there and hoping it worked. And then I had to set up databases, but it was like, I don't want to do this. This is really hard. And for a long time, it was like, oh, okay, now that I understand that what I like doing is the front end, I don't want to go anywhere near back end. For me, that is just like too much and too complicated. But as you say, I came to a point where I was frustrated that there was no one available to help me do some of the side projects that I wanted to do. And Pawel, we can talk about a different situation in a moment. But, still, I by default then was investigating into, okay, well, what can I do to push my boundaries a little bit? And now that I understand from working for a few years as a front ender how APIs work and things like that, well, is there something that can help me kind of write my own APIs? And suddenly I am wearing both hats, right? I'm not a good backender by any stretch, but I'm starting to span that line. Pawel, what about for you? I mean, does that strike any chords with you? How did it play out for you?
Yeah. So the first company I actually that I was hired in an IT department was a company that, for a start, took some startup projects, and so we had to be everything. Every single one of us had to be a full stack developer, like a real full stack developer. And the technology which we used back then was Ruby on Rails, and it was really easy to pick up, and the community was really great. So I really have to say that if, at least at that time, I'm really grateful for the community, especially. And I worked as a full stack for quite some time, for 6 years or something similar. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed writing APIs, figuring out how to optimize some queries. I worked with many different database solutions and migrating from one to another. Every project was a bit different and interesting on its own. But at some point, I think I realized that the results I have, like this second that I steal from the request or anything else that I optimize, is not actually something visible, if you know what I mean. And whenever I started working with actual designs that I had to implement, there was immediate result of it. Like I could see after an hour or two of my work, I could immediately see an effect of it. And that was much more rewarding, I would say. And after those 7 years, I just thought to myself, well, I can't be a specialist in everything. I need to narrow it somehow. And that's why I had to pick either to be a backender or a frontender to be able to actually achieve the goal of being a specialist. And that's why I think I picked being a frontender at that moment. So like a strictly frontender, where I'm still trying not to get involved into backend stuff, but like anytime I have to wait for a backender or some sort of interactions with them, I tend to actually dig into the code and trying to figure out myself. Maybe it's quicker, maybe it's not, but I just don't like to wait, I suppose. But still, yeah, I think that's how it went with me.
I think if I just cut in there, Pawel, I think that's really something that chimes with me as well. I think with front end, there's nearly always just a little bit of wanting to show off your work, and with front end, honestly, that's a lot easier. I mean, like the back end, they do some incredible things, but you go home in the evening and say, "Oh, look at this that I've been working on." It's not so impressive if it's just code. Like if you've got something in a browser that you can show your other half, then you do have that sense of like you've created something. I mean, it goes back all the way back for me when I first saw somebody write "Hello World" in a HTML page and saw that through the browser, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. Like I can actually see it. You fix something and you see it working. So I think there is a little bit of ego with front end.
Yeah, definitely. That's the case. I also personally, like I said, I steered away from it for a while because I think maybe one of the base levels of backend is the kind of like getting yourself into a server and playing around there. I know that's more maybe like sysops or something like that, but this command line, being able to be really good at that. And most people, that's not the first thing they dive into. They're using other technologies and it seems intimidating. And for me, the reason I bring it up is that a lot of these GUIs or these graphical user interfaces that we have are there because someone was like, yeah, I don't have enough. I don't know what's going on here. It's too hard for me to understand when it's just a series of command line things. Let me make a user interface for this. And that for me is where the distinction lies a lot. It's, yes, I could just do this as efficiently as possible, or I could spend more time, but make it so that it's maybe more accessible to a larger portion of people. Do you agree, David? Do you want to speak?
But don't you have the feeling sometimes, for instance, when you're using a certain specific utility for committing with Git, don't you have the feeling that sometimes you want to know what is going under the hood? Because I've got the feeling that many developers, they are clicking on, the commit or the fetch or the synchronize button, but they don't really know what is going under these scenes. I'm constantly seeking that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we had a lot of people working in our company right now, and I had to explain in detail how like, for example, Git is working under the hood, because they were, as you say, they basically did not even understand how it works. They just had those few buttons, and that was enough for them.
Yeah. So, I mean, that to me would be a simplicity of a reflection of what the backend would represent and why it made me, start thinking on why not dedicating more time onto this, especially now that we are becoming more cloud dependent on solutions and architecture of big solutions become, you have to, if you want to dig into one specific server, you need to start knowing a little bit how at least they have been all pieced together. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I take your meaning for sure. For me though, that what you're describing is actually just a lack of proper UI. So there is something missing. If you're not able to see everything that's really going on at will, then someone intentionally left something out, which is not always ideal, or they just didn't implement it, which is also not always ideal. I don't know. We've had some conversations as well of like what you display, and someone that I worked with for a while was really adamant about never lie to the end users. But for me, they took it even too far. They said, okay, well, until I don't want to show a placeholder item in this list when you hit create, because that's a lie, because it is saying that the item is maybe going to be created soon, but you don't know because the server hasn't responded with a yes or no. And the discussion there devolved into yes, I'm right, no, I'm right kind of a thing. But I think the point was it's a contentious issue because you're trying to represent something on the front end that the back end is responsible for. So maybe that's a good segue into a next topic of conversation, which is what is your understanding of the overlap between the two, and like where does it really start to be a front ender's responsibility for something versus a back ender's?
For me,
yeah.
I'll just talk a little bit about this. I mean, as a rule, you would try not to be like so hard and fast about like the things that you actually do. If you have the ability to do it and you're contributing to a project, then why not step in and actually fix something that needs fixing? I mean, like Pabel alluded to earlier on, like if he sees something or he's waiting for a back ender and he thinks that he can fix this himself, then why not? I mean, as long as project etiquette is maintained, and you're not really upsetting anybody, I think that maybe you shouldn't actually worry about treading on people's toes and worry about that overlap. It's down to knowledge for me. If I'm working on a project and one of the backenders has good JavaScript, for instance, and they come to me and say, "Oh, I noticed that this was wrong. I just fixed it. Have you got a problem with that?" I think, of course not. Like it goes back to something that we've talked about before, where you want the feeling of all being like one team. If you have the ability, then why not do it? I don't think that we need like hard and fast divisions. I don't know whether the guys have found like examples of like good and bad practice over the years.
Do you want to go first, Pawel?
I mean, I totally agree with what Scott just said. I never draw a strict line between one or the other. I know people that some people basically split it by like a file type, like they don't touch anything that ends with JS or anything similar, and the other way around with Java or any other extension. But as Scott mentioned, for me, it's a matter of communication between both of the teams, backenders and frontenders. If they are fine if one team is fine with the other fixing something or adding, and if it's still along with how they with their maybe practices, then I guess it's fine, and that's actually a helpful thing because they can still be focused on their tasks.
So my experience, it depends a lot on the context on the project. I found in bigger projects, people that was more back-end specialized, trying to architecture or re-architecture the front-end application from scratch because they thought that it was a better approach, but they were lacking the experience and knowledge of what were the consequences of the changes they were about to apply, right? And there I would disagree because, such a big change, small change, but with a big impact would require, some consensus, I would say, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, if I wouldn't be like too too strict, or I wouldn't be strict at all if you're speaking of the context of a, I don't know, indie hacker who is just running, a prototype application and needs to, with a few collaborators, maximum of 3 to 5 people, they need to quick deliver and iterate. Then, yeah, why not? Let's change and iterate over the code, and let's worry a little bit about the implications of then later, right? Because in the very end, we just need flexibility to deliver. That's the main core concept of it, in my opinion. Yeah, that's how I feel it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. When I have kind of gone off on the indie route and tried to do my own stuff, I feel like a junior again, which is to say I know that there are best practices that exist for setting up APIs and for dealing with, like, the response comes in from the front end, which is weird enough as a front ender to be thinking of that way, what to do with it, how long to respond, what the correct server response code is, and all these sorts of things. That already becomes overwhelming. So I imagine it's the same in reverse, and you have to respect that. Usually the person that is going to be switching hats like that is not going to be the same level on both. They might be a senior backender, but they're going to be acting as a junior frontender, and they need to respect the rules and roles of the project in that regard. Yeah. That also kind of goes into another thing, which for me has been coming up as I work on some side projects, which is the tooling. And front-end is notorious for taking over everything that it can. And I think that's also bled over into back-end as well, which is to say it's not front-end anymore. It's still, it's back-end, but JavaScript in particular has taken over some back-ends. And there are two things that come to mind. One is, everyone knows about Node, but recently one of the creators of Node has come out with Deno, which is just a scrambled version of Node. But the idea is it's rebuilt from the ground up to be much more like asynchronous, and promises are native to it, and all these sorts of things. And that potentially is going to see a surge of new, non-browser applications that are written in JavaScript that are faster and more performant than Node apps by themselves could be. And then the second tool, just for throwing out there a discussion point, are frameworks like Nest.js, which is sort of putting a TypeScript Angular flavor on top of Node and Express in particular, so that you can architect and feel like you're still working within Angular even while you're working on backend sort of stuff. Have either of you had experience with those kind of technologies, or thought or heard about them, or anything to share? Pabel, maybe start with you.
Yeah, mostly with just pure Node, actually. And for like personal projects, I tend to actually back up with different stuff. Elixir, for instance, with Phoenix. But recently I have to give some credits for Firebase also, because if you need a really simple backend for your front-end app, that's, I would say, for now, a really good route to pick. But yeah, right now, as I said, I'm really trying to not get into backend anymore. So I stick to Node at this point.
That's fair.
On my side, I've heard of Deno. I've been following this since a little bit of a time, although I haven't developed yet a production-ready application. Well, the tool itself is still not production-ready. They have released recently version 1, right? So it feels to me that a new sort of a concept based on what we have had as experience with the NPM dependencies or version management based on a Node technology was kind of needed. But who has been the developer that hasn't been struggling with sort of dependency issues on the project? But also it's been designed on top of a different security model, and security centric in this case, because, well, I don't know if you have experience working with Go, for instance, but how do you establish the dependencies, how they are working together? It's kind of similar. So in the very end, it makes the job of importing dependencies much simpler. So I don't know if these guys, the creators, they have had influences on other tools like, as I said, Go. But to me, it feels like kind of a good decision. So I'm looking forward to develop first with these ones. But recently, I haven't been touching Nest, for instance, but recently I have been developing a application, which, by the way, got live a couple of weeks ago using Django, Firebase, as Pawel mentioned, and also React. It's been quite amazing how and easy how Django provides you with the enhanced tool set ready for, with a few bits of code, provide a full REST API which you can easily start consuming. Of course, all Dockerized, so you're just running it locally and you start typing on React, and that feels like proper joy, I would say.
I think for me as well, it's interesting. I mean, as you mentioned earlier on, Evan, like that JavaScript seems to permeate many things now, including the backend. It was a couple of weeks ago I was taking a look at a new Adobe product, and the backend logic is all basically done in JavaScript, which, like, it seems like once again, like JavaScript just permeates something else. But I mean, when you think of that, it opens up the possibilities for front end people to actually start really thinking in terms of the back end, and especially for someone like me, where, as I said before, it's not that I don't like doing the front end, like the CSS, because I do, but it does definitely open up opportunities to actually move, like, almost into like a center ground, if you like. So, like, maybe this is where, you know, the two worlds collide. Maybe this is like where the overlap happens on the diagram. It's just something that really, like, interests me, that it's actually that the two worlds are actually coming together through products like this.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind for me there is you were talking earlier about, you know, being comfortable or having a mindset that's maybe more the back of the front end. And I'm curious as to all of your kind of level of comfort. So what I find is that as a front ender, I'm much more willing to take chances, which is to say, because I have that instant feedback, is this working or not? For me, it's not as intense to sort of break something temporarily. Whereas I think with the back end, you maybe have a mindset that's much more cautious. I mean, there's backenders tend to run a lot of tests, right? At least our backenders do. They write a lot of tests. And I wonder two things there. One, okay, yes, they want to be sure that what they're writing is going to work, so that when it breaks, it doesn't take 5 hours of downtime on the product to get it working again. But two, maybe it's part of seeing a visual feedback for themselves as to what they've written is actually working or not. But that mindset there, that is what for me is a big separation between the two, is level of comfort with potentially having something you've written in code break. I mean, does that resonate with you, David?
I'm thinking in terms of, again, type of project. When I'm working on small projects, I tend to disagree there because, for instance, if I'm provisioning a certain application to a certain server in Amazon Web Services, and I want now to plug in a in-memory cache layer with Redis, I like to you know, how I'm initializing those processes, and I like to see how they are failing when I'm boot. So in some sort of a way, you get a direct feedback after you start applying the changes and connecting with the client to that. But of course, it's not visual. I cannot deny that. However, if the project scale is much greater in terms of, I don't know, you are developing an API which provides a payment gateway, I'm pretty sure that mostly all of us would agree that they would like to have pretty well covered that change, so that at your continuous integration pipeline, when running a pull request, then you would validate and test whether your changes went fine or not. Because how else could you do it? What is the guarantee you could have? Because you don't have a visual interface to see whether what you did was correct or not, right?
Yeah, for sure. I absolutely agree with you. I think that there's a valid reason for having that in place. I really just wonder, like, why is it so that a lot of front-enders are much more casual about that? Is it just the security of being able to visually test something, or is maybe something else at play?
No. I guess probably some people will throw some stones on my head, but I guess it's because the implications of the changes in most of the cases, they are lower than on certain service implementations. But of course, that depends again, right? So in the very end, you are maybe changing a certain. Well, if it is a layout change, then you would agree, but then it is true that certain front-end applications involve core business logic, especially nowadays. So then that would play against my own opinion. So don't know. What do you think, Ash?
Yeah, Pawel, do you have any thoughts?
Actually, I would have to fully agree with David that everything depends on the scope, or actually the size of the project, and what's the main goal of it, and adjusting to that based on that. But on top of that, I have to say I always like to have like a control over what's going on under the hood and everywhere. Actually, even now, when I have a stack of backenders working in the same on the same project, I do like to know, like if like when there's some sort of issue on the backend side, at least how to, put the fire down.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, you see the rise of things like TypeScript in recent years, and it is given those that write front-end code a lot more control over the things that they do. This calls back to someone I used to work with, but they despised TypeScript because for them it was a restriction. But for me, since I've been using it, it has been like just a safety net, and that has felt much more empowering than other things. It's, the same way as when you write your tests and you do a good job on your tests, you're comfortable to change things and break things potentially because you'll be caught out for it. And having no tests is really dangerous in certain aspects. So yeah, I think that's maybe not exclusively a backend sort of thing, but you look at TypeScript and it borrows a lot of the things from Java, actually, that the backenders have been using to provide themselves with that sort of level of safety. So there's crossover. I guess that's the key here.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I have an anecdote regarding the TypeScript. So I was talking with a really close friend of mine who is like a really old backender to the root, and we were talking, and he was recently interested in React, so he started reading about it and going through some tutorials, and he said that the biggest issue he sees while working with a front end is that he never knows what sort of like arguments you have, or what can an object keep inside. And I was like, well, there's this thing called TypeScript, which basically gives you this full control over it. And he was like, wow, now, yeah, you're right. This looks like Java now, actually.
Yeah, I've noticed the same also for people who came with very strong mindset in .NET, for instance, or Java as well. For some reason, they're feeling like much on control of the code and the project itself if they are using static typing or it's not dynamic typing, so you can kind of predict, or which is going to be the input and what type of input you're going to have and what type of output, right? which is, I agree with Evan. It's a great addition, for instance, for technologies used on the front end as TypeScript. Yeah. Well, it's been tried to be solved with certain checkers, like for the React one, was it called Flow? I can't remember now. But
yeah, Flow.
Yeah, it's gaining some momentum right now, TypeScript, on the community, I would say. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that I think the resistance, or any kind of resistance to TypeScript, kind of plays into the stereotype of the split between backend and front end. I mean, the idea that everybody's entitled to their own opinion, everybody's entitled to use the technology that they feel comfortable with. But for me, the idea that that TypeScript would somehow constrain you as a front end developer, it wouldn't let you do the things that you wanted to do, or like, it's almost like the developers feel that they should be able to run with whatever they want, and they shouldn't be constrained by these things. And that almost plays into the stereotype, I think. The resistance to this, like the resistance, why should you have all of these rules? You know, like I'm going to be free of these rules, and being free of those is going to help us create like these amazing things. When, I mean, like, that's not really the case at all. And I really think that the resistance to that, whether it's somebody doesn't want to learn like TypeScript and so they instantly resist it, but in the end, if it's there, then it helps you to actually gain that control to develop better applications, then I don't see why there would be the resistance from it, apart from like maybe it just plays into that character a little bit. Maybe those front enders just don't want to be the back enders, and that's why they chose to code everything in JavaScript, because it was a little looser. So for me, it's interesting that, like, I'd like to see why people really resist using something like TypeScript.
Wouldn't you agree on the following? Because in my experience, I've seen how when a certain project source code has to scale, then using technologies which are stricter helps somehow, because it allows you to organize better. I'm just speaking high level now. And whereas if you're developing small pieces or small projects, then having the flexibility of, not going and defining specific classes and models and all sort of things gives you the, speeding up with what you want to achieve.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that once you start getting beyond, once you start getting to a certain scale of a project, like, I guess at the moment, all of us would probably be involved in like pretty big projects where like these kind of safeguards would actually help us. Yeah, for sure. If you were just doing like a really, really tiny application, or you wanted something quick, to actually structure that and develop types in TypeScript would probably be overkill. But in general, when you're working for like bigger projects, I can't see why there would be like the resistance other than a learning curve, really.
Yeah, generally what I've found is that it feels like you want to not bother when you're working on these smaller projects, but if those projects ever do grow, then you really regret it. The same as, adding something like material to a degree, Angular material, or Bootstrap or something like that. Especially when you use the components from those component libraries, it's harder to extract them later, and you kind of regret your decision as you start to grow in scope. And I think the same thing is true for these kind of technologies. I do also think that this is where we're going to get maybe the most feedback on our podcast that we've had in a long time, because I know there are people out there that really don't agree. They have valid reasons for not choosing something like TypeScript, and not just to focus on that. There are other ways of thinking and monorepos and things that are coming from the backend world over into ours. And maybe for them, those that are opposed to this really is the key of backend villainy. The backenders are spreading their agenda to the front end that was pure and good before, and now we're being corrupted by the dark side. Maybe not. Maybe that's pure rhetoric. In any case, we're getting to that point in the show where we have to start to wrap up. First thing is we wanted to continue on with our segment, True Heroes. In this segment, we want to highlight a few true front-end heroes working across the planet and thank them for all that they do. In this case, I think Scott and I both share the same one, which is a person that works within our company but is just a tireless advocate of performance, as we talked about in a previous episode, and accessibility, and has brought that up to the forefront of discussion with our clients. So a big shout out to Fabian Krumpholz, who is no longer a front-ender per se, but is truly a front-end hero at heart. Yeah, Scott, anything to say about Fabian?
I would just like to say that, I've always known Fabian's dedication to performance, to web performance, and he's really helped me in the last couple of weeks. Really helped a lot. Really pushed things to a client. Really with the sole aim of actually making things better directly for the client. And it's been his professionalism has just been outstanding. His knowledge incredible. So I'm with you. I think he deserves a big shout for that.
Thanks. And tossing it to our guests, I know this is putting you on the spot, and if need be, I can always fiddle the audio to edit out the response if it's too much. But do you have anyone that has sort of inspired you in terms of the front-end community and brought you up to a higher level or pushed you to be better than you were, or something like that that would make you call them out as a front-end hero?
I do, and he inspired me in the very initial moments of my front-end career. His name is Arnau, and he was also part of the NetCentric community. So he was a very talented developer in all senses. He was also specialized on the UX sort of fifth fill-in, and I learn a lot with him. So I'm always recalling him when I still have to do some front-end work.
Thanks. Pavel, anyone come to mind?
Yes, actually, that's you, Evan, actually, to be honest. As funny as it is, but yes, that's actually you. So the thing is, when I first time met you and started working with you, I remember I was the one who was pro Angular and you were really into Vue.js. And at some point at time, you switched sides. And later on, there was another project where I was able to freely choose the technology for it. And I thought, well, you were so into that Vue.js, and I remember you telling me all those benefits of using it and how easy it is to pick up. So I just actually thought, why not? Why not trying the Vue.js? And at that point, I actually learned quite a few things. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, well, thanks for calling me out. It's maybe a bit on the nose, but I do strive to be that. And in a future episode, we're going to talk about mentoring and sharing with the community as well. So maybe that'll be a good lead-in for that. Thanks. Our next segment, Any Proper Hero, is going to be a well-rounded one. So we want to share some simple musical picks from us. So Scott, what is the favorite thing you've been listening to lately?
Well, last weekend, I was actually talking to a friend, and he told me that Stevie Wonder had a run of 6 albums consecutive, which were all-time classic albums. And I'd listened to one of them, and so last week for me was a Stevie Wonder week. And out of all the ones that I listened to, there's an album, Inner Visions, which was just an absolute piece of. An absolute masterpiece. So I spent a lot of time last week listening to Stevie Wonder, and Inner Visions is definitely my pick.
Awesome. Thanks. David, maybe you can go next if you have one.
Yes. Lastly, I have been listening in a daily basis, especially at night, Uprising from Muse. Because my son is getting asleep as he's starting to listen to that song. So that's my best strategy to make him fall asleep quickly. So yeah, that's sort of what I'm listening lastly.
That's amazing. He falls asleep to Muse.
Yes, he does. It's amazing. And it's funny at the same time, yeah.
Awesome. All right. Pawel, a pick from you?
I actually have two, if I may. One is John Coltrane and another one is Sonny Rollins. The saxophone was always number one instrument in my heart, and recently I just have a taste for it even more.
Okay, that's awesome. I will ask you for the show notes, in particular, a couple albums and specifics, just to get people started. But yeah, that's great. Good choices. For me as well, I will go a little off. I still haven't done an electronic recommendation, even though that's mostly what I listen to. But someone at work turned me on to a group called Pamplemousse, which they do amazing covers, really great groove. And they have an EP out. I guess it's an album called En Français. They mostly release their stuff on YouTube, and they're a real joy to watch. They're amazing. But this one in particular has a lot of French songs and covers of things like, Les Yeux Noirs, and my French accent is terrible, but Les Champs-Élysées and things like that. So it's a real fun album to listen to. Okay, good. With that out of the way, I think that's all the time we have for today. We're right around our mark. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for our guests for participating. If you enjoyed the show, you should like, heart, star us in your podcatcher of choice. Reviews and ratings are how those fancy algorithms help people find our content, and the power to help is within you. If you have any questions or topics you would like to cover in our next episode, send a tweet to us at Heroes Frontend, and we'll add it to our list. As well, if you have any questions for our guests, we'll either link you up to their Twitter accounts or find their responses asynchronously somehow. In any case, please feel free to ask away. And until next time, heroes, remember, with great front-end power comes great responsibility. See you next time.